Yes, her Barnett was incredible, wasn't it?
Do you know, it reminds me of, it's very Dolly Parton. You know what she said? She was like, the higher the hair, the closer to God. And I thought, yes, that is what Penny is channeling.
Okay, hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction Extra Inches. I'm not sure I meant to say that, but I did anyway. I'm in Grimsby ahead of the Sky Leaders event on Wednesday. More of that later on. Ayesha Hazarika, last week you were in Greece, now you're back in. Well, it's a bit rainy up in Grimsby. Where are you and is it raining?
I'm in from sunny, sun-drenched Greece. I'm now in Brixton, southwest London, and it's great.
Ruth.
Can I just say, it is 10 days until the longest day of the year. And we haven't even had spring yet, never mind summer. Like, what has happened?
We have got lots to get onto in this episode. We will be talking about that D-Day blunder. It's been described as the defining mistake of the general election campaign and the response to it. Can Rishi Sunak get on top? I have to say the bat phone was in meltdown over the weekend as messages came in of sheer despair. Actually, I can't put it any other way, from Conservative candidates. Well, we'll get into the news that the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, is standing down after the election, deciding to land that one 3 weeks out, or slightly just over 3 weeks out from polling day. Ruth, I think you've got a lot to say about that. We'll come back to you. It's manifesto launch week. We'll talk about the policies and how the parties will pay for them and the art of the political interview. I'm going to be doing a couple of quite big ones of those this week, so we can talk about that. Now, we've had loads of emails and WhatsApp messages and we'll be getting to them later in the podcast, but keep emailing us on electoraldysfunction@sky.uk and keep WhatsApping us on the burner phone 07934 200 444. Now, let's go back to Rishi Sunak. I think we can all agree that last week was pretty disastrous for the PM. A snap poll after the first TV debate showed he'd come out on top, actually, but then he made this terrible blunder, leaving the D-Day 80th anniversary ceremony early, leaving his foreign secretary to stand on the stage, actually, on Omar Beach with the President of the United States, because he had come back to London. I think that image of Macron, President of France, Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, Biden, standing with David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, will be one that will go down in the history books, actually. But he had all of that. Now, on Friday, Mr. Sunak did apologise for skipping the D-Day event, but it's not put the lid on the criticism. There were even rumours flying around at one point he might have to step down. And the Cabinet Minister put out on the Sunday round was even asked by my colleague Trevor Phillips, is the Prime Minister going to resign or quit the campaign? I can't even remember a campaign where that question would even be asked in normal times. So I want to get into the D-Day blunder in a second, but first we need to talk about the Scottish Conservatives, because Douglas Ross is stepping down as their leader after the election. Ruth, it's 3 weeks to go until polling day, and Douglas Ross has just announced he's going. What on earth is happening?
Quick kind of catch-up for people that haven't been following this. The Scottish Tories actually went into this election pretty chipper, thinking that they would be in the hunt to hold what they have and maybe even put on a seat or two, depending on how the votes fall. So it looked as if they would be doing pretty well. By all accounts, Douglas Ross had a pretty solid start to the campaign. One of the MPs that had held Anthem Buchan's seat, he was struck down by a very serious illness at the start of the year. Was in critical condition in a hospital in Aberdeen. I mean, I cannot stress the seriousness of it enough. And then he had a partial recovery. He was moved to a specialist spinal rehabilitation unit in Glasgow. He would not have been able to campaign in this election, and he would and will be in a hospital bed in a rehab ward for the entirety of the campaign, over 100 miles from his constituency. And the party decided, the management board that runs the party in Scotland, that almost kind of for his own benefit, they wouldn't sign his papers to be the nominated candidate for that. So it's a really horrible situation. Nobody would have wanted to say to him, you can't fight an election from a hospital bed 100 miles away. And he himself wanted to do it, but just not being on the campaign trail. Allied to that is the fact that then the very next day, because we were so close to the poll, Douglas Ross said, I'll be the candidate then. So he's the leader in Scotland, and all hell broke loose within the party, because it looked to all of the world as if he was basically pulling the plug on an ill person in order to get their job and their seat. And I'm not sure that's the way it happened. I actually think the two things are probably separate, but it looked terrible. And because of that kind of opened up old wounds and some bad blood within the party. So there's all of this backstory, which makes it very complicated. So he's stood up today and he said that, I'm a distraction. I will not continue as leader after the election if I win the seat.
So is he going to stand in that seat? He is going to stand in that seat.
Yeah, he's the candidate. The candidate papers have gone in.
Did he go before he was pushed? And do you think that whatever he actually felt, to do this 3 weeks out of polling day when the party is 20 plus points behind in the polls, it's even more destabilising, right? Do you think he should have just shut up and carried on?
Yeah, I think in hindsight, he was having a pretty good election up until he put himself forward as the candidate. And even if the party management board's decision that David Duguid wasn't well enough to stand, even though he has said he was, and that would have been all right if it had been another candidate that put themselves forward. But I'm not entirely sure about the decision to announce that you're going to do it 3.5 weeks from polling day, because I think that part of the job sometimes is to take the hits. So there's different types of elections, and I've fought them all. I've fought ones where they're great fun and you're trying to get votes out of other people and your party's growing. And I've also fought ones when you're on the back foot and you're getting punched every single day. And part of the job is to take the punches. That's what leadership kind of is. You would want the party to be as united as possible north of the border going to the polls, irrespective of whatever's happening with the campaign down south.
Ruth, what's the sort of morale amongst your colleagues in Scotland over this?
I think that there will be people within the party that think that, he should have gutted this out for the next 3.5 weeks, because it's 3.5 weeks and you get up in the morning and you put on a suit and you paint on a smile and you go out there and you do your job.
I'm getting the impression, Ruth, and I don't want to push you, and you say what, in our friendly pod world, you say what I'm not going to try and pin you to the wall.
Yeah.
But do you sort of, from your point of view, you were the former leader, you really built the party back up in Scotland. Do you feel he should have stayed?
In the best will in the world, he wouldn't have put himself forward for the seat, and all of this would have been avoided, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. I care so much about how much work and effort was put into building the party up in Scotland, and some of the seats that are hanging in the balance here, there are people that were elected first under me and are not just colleagues, but are friends, and I feel like I was really in the trenches with them, and they were part of the project that we had when I was leader. But I think it's going to be a tough 3.5 weeks. It just feeds into a narrative, though, that we've seen down south, that the Tories are falling apart this election. It feeds into that narrative, and that's difficult. But on the grand scheme of things, I think this is very different from the D-Day stuff, which I think is cataclysmic, actually.
Just to finish off on this, Ruth, I mean, talking about, the feeling, I mean, it also gives your opponents so much ammunition. I mean, Alex Salmond said this morning, it's the first case of a rat deserting a sinking ship whilst simultaneously trying to clamber aboard a gravy train. And that's the problem, isn't it?
We're not fishing in the same pool as Alba
No.
for our voters. So
No.
what Alex Salmond says, I mean, he's a man that's desperately trying to have a second or a third act after really some quite unpleasant things. So the idea that he calls anyone a rat, let's all take that with a pinch of salt. I think it makes what was already going to be a tough 3.5 weeks for Douglas, it makes it harder having pre-announced his resignation.
It feeds in also to sort of a bigger question around the campaign and how the Conservative campaign's been going, because actually the polls are widening, not narrowing, and it was a pretty tough week for the Prime Minister last week. Ayesha, what would you do if you were advising Rishi Sunak on how to try and recover, if he can, from what happened last week around D-Day?
Well, I think the first thing that I would do is have the key people in the room and deliver a really tough message about honesty. There is no way that the Conservative Party can turn this around now. It's not even like watching a car crash. It's like watching a continual motorway pile-up happening in real time. And it feels like a sort of contagion has now gripped the Conservative Party. And in politics, sometimes, you talk a lot about strategy and messaging, but luck is a big part of politics as well. You hear this phrase, or such and such is a lucky general. Well, right now, the Conservative Party does feel like it's cursed. Rishi Sunak and his team feel like they are the sort of reverse of the Midas touch. Everything they touch turns to sort of sewage. I mean, that is literally where which go into the rivers and the sea. I mean, that is literally where things are at the moment. And I think when you're in a sort of political death spiral, on a psychological level, sort of steady yourself, because everybody is in panic mode. So I would start by getting his team in a room and getting them to at least acknowledge the reality of just how utterly, utterly, shockingly bad things are. And I think you have to take that as a starting point.
So Ayesha, just going back to what you were saying about the sort of pile up, I was talking to someone in the Labour Party in one of the senior team, trying to get a sense of how serious they thought it was. And I said to this person, some people are calling it Sunak's Gillian Duffy moment. Now, you might remember that if you're listening, it was back in 2010. And Gordon Brown had quite a difficult exchange with a woman called Gillian Duffy and got into the car and was still on mic. I mean, this is the kind of classic in the thick of it, just total cock up. And he called her a bigoted woman. She was trying to talk to him about concerns about immigration, wasn't she? It snowballed into a massive crisis. And I mean, even, these moments, they're these moments with all the noise around politics, and 14 years later, we can all remember Gillian Duffy. Anyway, I said to someone, is it the Gillian Duffy moment? And actually, this person said to me, they thought it was worse than the Gillian Duffy moment.
I will tell you why it's worth, Beth. So speaking as a Conservative that has formerly served in Her Majesty's Armed Forces and. I mean, this is not just, you said at the beginning that this was the defining mistake of the campaign. You're being far too kind. This is worse than, Michael Foot wearing a donkey jacket to the cenotaph. This is worse than Gordon Brown. It's that bigoted woman. Because one of the things that Conservatives are supposed to stand for, and this is beyond policy and beyond personality, this is about values. And the idea that there was not a single person around the Prime Minister, even if he didn't recognise what his schedule meant himself, there was not a single person that didn't understand that. Even if you take away the fact that the core vote strategy that is now being run is trying to peel people back from reform, who are generally older, generally are more likely to have touch points with the armed forces, are more likely to watch events like D-Day commemorations. You could not think of a worse thing for a Conservative Prime Minister to do.
Just cut to the chase. Ayesha just said they can't come. You said at the beginning of what when you were talking about it, Ayesha, you said they cannot turn this around now.
No.
Ruth, do you agree that they're done? Like, whatever happens now, it's irrecoverable.
You can't make this mistake right. But what you have to do is to continue to do what I said before, which is get up every morning, put on the suit, get yourself out there. The idea that you hide away and you cut back your media, actually, that's not okay either. You do have to show leadership because there are seats out there that are winnable.
Ayesha?
I've been thinking a lot about how this cock-up could have happened. And I think it goes to a fundamental identity crisis that the Tory party is having. The fact that none of the gang around Rishi Sunak, someone's called them the amateur scribblers around Rishi Sunak, the fact that none of them, from Isaac Levido to James Forsyth to anybody else, none of them clocked that leaving D-Day was going to be the mother of all gaffes, makes me think they have lost they've lost their political compass. They don't know who they are. One day they're chasing reform. The other day they're doing culture wars. The other day they're trying to actually be big state and go on about how they saved everybody during furlough. This is a party which is in the midst of a fundamental existential crisis. When the penny doesn't even drop that D-Day is important, you have lost your bearings big time.
You were obviously advising in Labour back in 2010 when the Gillian Duffy debacle happened. Talk me through a bit about kind of what that was like and what you imagined was going on behind closed doors at Downing Street, because it was interesting, wasn't it? It began to break that evening and I knew immediately, I was like, this is massive, this is mega. And then that morning, an apology was out in the breakfast news. Yeah. What happens inside the bunker?
It's so horrific when something like this happens, because as an advisor, when you watch this stuff happen, and I was in Labour HQ in London when the Mrs. Duffy stuff happened, and you're watching it on Sky News or whatever, and at the beginning, there's almost like a sort of naive hope that maybe it won't be this bad. Like, people often sort of say, maybe it'll be like, when John Prescott punched that guy and actually it was funny, bad, but it wasn't like bad. But there are things like the Mrs. Duffy moment, or there are things like this when you just know as an advisor, literally your blood runs ice cold and you know that this is an absolute fuck up of the highest proportions. And also, in your gut, in your absolute gut, when there's a gaffe that's so big, it's going to be like the defining moment of an election campaign. And we certainly knew that with Mrs. Duffy. And I'll be absolutely honest about what happened after the Mrs. Duffy thing. We never got on the front foot again after that. And in fact, about a week later, we tried to do a rebrand. Now, when you're rebranding and relaunching your election campaign midway through your election campaign, that's a bit of a clue that things are not going tickety-boo. And we actually did a relaunch with Gordon, Peter Mandelson, all the cabinet. And this summed up how bad that election campaign was going for us. At the relaunch, there was a car crash right next to the relaunch. A car crashed into a bus stop right near the relaunch as Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson were doing the "it's time to get this campaign back on track" cut to eek, crash, the sound of splintering glass. And then everybody just froze as this car crash happened. And that's what I mean about being cursed. Sometimes the luck is just not with you in a campaign, and it really feels like that for the Conservatives. When Sam Coates did the interview with Rishi Sunak about the apology, Rishi Sunak did not look like somebody who was absolutely, in his heart and in his soul, mortified about what had happened, and he was so ashamed. He looked really pissed off with Sam. He looked quite kind of cross that these questions were being put to him. And he kept clinging to this thing about, it was the itinerary. I'm
going to come back to that apology because we've had this voice note in from Heather.
Hi, Beth, Ruth and Ayesha. I've just watched Rishi apologising for bunking off a D-Day event. I'm so fed up with politicians apologising for their cock-ups and expecting everybody else to move on. What is an apology from a politician worth these days? Love you all.
That's really nice. I'm glad you love us all, Heather.
Yeah.
I love them too.
Thanks, Heather.
What is an apology from a politician worth these days, Ruth?
I think it's only worth something if you mean it. And I think you have to show that you mean it. He did the, I'm sorry, but here's the more important thing. And actually, a full prostrate, I actually can't believe we've done this cock up. I don't know how it happened. It should never have happened. And I cannot apologise enough. Just do the mea culpa and make it count.
Final thing. Do you remember when with Boris Johnson wouldn't apologise for all the Partygate stuff? Do you remember? And then I got him that time. We were in a hospital. I went to do the interview in a hospital and it was a pool clip. And that was the first time he'd spoken since it had merged. There'd been a party in Downing Street the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. And he hung his head. I remember he had a mask on, but he hung his head. And he looked genuinely quite broken by all of it. And I guess as a politician, it's really hard because you've got to put on a front all the time, haven't you? There's another iteration of this D-Day. Let's talk a bit about Nigel Farage's response to it. First of all, he said it was unpatriotic. He went on to say that Rishi Sunak's actions showed he didn't understand our culture. and also said he is utterly disconnected by class and privilege from how ordinary folk in this country feel. Ayesha.
I do think Rishi Sunak is quite out of touch with the country on a number of reasons, but there's no need to sort of send a massive dog whistle out. This is our first Asian, Indian Prime Minister, British heritage Asian. I mean, it just shows you that Nigel Farage, whatever you're talking about, I mean, he could have absolutely put the boot in, particularly from Reform. A lot of older people, really patriotic, care about this stuff.
And Ruth, talking about fighting every inch over and over again, Reform, Nigel Farage, this is now a really live discussion in your party amongst your colleagues. Are we going to have a crossover moment where Reform are polling above the Conservatives? And you had the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, today in the Times calling for the party to embrace Farage, saying there's not much difference between Reform policies and the Conservatives. I mean, Ruth.
There might not be much difference between Suella Braverman and Nigel Farage, but there's a hell of a difference between me and Nigel Farage.
But can you be in a party where Farage is in the party? Would you have to leave?
Firstly, I still don't believe there's going to be an enormous rump of Reform MPs after the election. I think there will be a crisis of identity within the Conservative Party post the election. I think we're heading to that anyway, with or without Nigel Farage coming back to lead Reform. So people that are of the centre right, and I would say that I'm centre right, absolutely have a duty to stand up and fight for that part that they believe in, that kind of that small c conservatism, that fiscal responsibility, but with a social liberalism attached that says that you can do things in your own home without the state interfering in it, thanks very much, or without condemnation.
Say you end up in a situation where a leader, because I think Priti Patel has intimated that she might welcome Nigel, or I read some reports about that, I don't think she's formally said that. But say you end up in a world, Ruth, where you have a leader that's playing footsie with Nigel Farage. I mean, Braverman said she would embrace him, the party should embrace him. Could you stay in the Conservative Party?
There is an argument that people that do hold sensible, pragmatic, centre-right views need to continue to articulate that, whether you do that within or without or out with a party. I mean, that's a decision that many of us will be faced with should this come to pass. But if is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, Beth.
I think Ruth is right that Reform will only win a couple of seats. But look, even if Reform only win a couple of seats, that is still a big deal, okay? If Nigel Farage enters British politics, that is a big deal. I think we've got to stop kind of talking ourselves out of, hey, it's no biggie. I think the lessons I really look back on with Nigel Farage, and this includes how the Labour Party dealt with Nigel Farage, everybody kept going, oh, he's just a bit of a madman on the fringes, just ignore him, he'll go away. I think when you look back at the Conservative conference last year, which was largely lacklustre, where the conference had a thrill of excitement, a fizz of, wow, what's happening here? Where it felt like a new party was being reborn was in the fringes. Who were the stars of the show? Nigel Farage, Suella Braverman and Priti Patel. Let's say he becomes the Reform candidate for Clacton. Let's say Priti Patel or Suella Braverman becomes the leader of the Conservative in opposition, and that is highly plausible, by the way. They would welcome a defection from Nigel Farage. Now, once Nigel Farage is in the Conservative Party, all bets are off. I can't stand the man, but he's an effective political operator. He's like Japanese knotweed. Like, when he gets in, he gets in.
Look, we're going to move on there, but as Ayesha was saying, Nigel Farage came to party conference. There was a grassroots event with Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Priti Patel. Nigel Farage was there. He hasn't, it's interesting. He's now sort of put himself against the Conservatives, standing as the leader for Reform. But there is no doubt, and he's said it in previous interviews, that he wants to destroy the Conservative Party. This is a form of perhaps entryism where he gets into Parliament and then reverse takes over the Conservative Party if he can. So I think that the rise of the right and the threat of reform, whatever happens in this election, is going to be one of the key stories and trends of the post-election period. And I'm absolutely fascinated how it will play out, because I really can't predict it. And it was interesting that Kemi Badenoch, and I will stop after this because we've got to move on, but Kemi Badenoch, who's one of the other would-be candidates, she has made it clear that she would not let him back into the party. And it might be that, in a way, campaigns almost split in terms of the MPs about who will and who won't. I wonder if Nigel Farage becomes, in a way that Boris Johnson sort of helped determine, I think it's fair to say, that Liz Truss would win the leadership election and Rishi Sunak would not, because he was clear to grassroots members that he wanted someone that wasn't Rishi Sunak because he felt so betrayed. What will happen? And actually, there's always, of course, the question of, would Boris Johnson get tapped up again? I mean, it's so... We could do it. Well, I'd like to carry on talking about that, but we can't because we've run out, so we have to come back to it. Because we've got to pause, because we're back in a minute for Manifesto Week. It's manifesto launch week, all the main parties revealing their election pledges over the next few days, because basically we're about 3 weeks out from the polls and postal votes start to drop at the end of this week. So they've got to get the offers on the table. OK, Ruth, the rumours are that the Conservative manifesto is going to read to over 70 pages long. Do you think that this is going to be like Rishi Sunak with sort of endless offers in an attempt to sort of try and pull back some voters?
The cynics within politics would say that the best manifestos that are written are a front page and nothing in between, a front page, a back page and nothing in between, because you want to have the biggest sort of sphere of manoeuvrability that you can in office. I think because the Tories are starting so far behind in the polls that they've taken this view that they've got to have big offerings to the public of big ideas, so things like national service, etc. And I also think that people have sort of stopped listening, I think, is the problem, to the Conservatives in this election. I think this glut of big ideas, we're going to take 2% of this. I mean, I thought probably the most effective attack that we had in the first head-to-head leader debate on ITV from Keir Starmer on Rishi Sunak was, well, if you think it's such a good idea, why haven't you done it already in the last 14 years?
One thing that was interesting to me, Ayesha, I come to you, is so the Lib Dems on Monday announced their manifesto, and within it there was 26.8 billion of tax increases, right? Of which there was a £9 billion pledge to put money into social care and the NHS. They were decided to increase capital gains taxes. Now, capital gains tax is when you get taxed, instead of your income, you get taxed on assets. So if you sell shares or if you sell a second home, like basically mainly stuff that richer people have, bluntly. So you get taxed capital gains, and you get taxed less on capital gains than you do on income tax. There's a bit of a debate going around about whether that's fair and whether if you are selling assets, you should be taxed more. OK, so there's a conversation about that. Now, the Lib Dems have gone in with both heels here, and they're going, we are going to charge more on capital gains. They're going to raise plus £5 billion for it. And Ed Davies stood on a platform and he said the top 0.1% will pay a lot more tax. That's millionaires and billionaires. Effectively, I'm watching him, Ayesha, and I'm like, wow, the Lib Dems have gone left of Labour when it comes to tax and spend, and the Labour Party are with the Conservative Party to argue the point. If you take Paul Johnson, who runs this place called the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is basically a think tank which we all use to help us understand government finances, he's talking about a conspiracy of silence between the two parties about no one wants to talk about raising taxes. Everyone says they can improve public services, and lo and behold, there's a massive gap. And at least the Lib Dems, right, they're being upfront about it. They're like, yeah, we're going to raise taxes to improve public services. Ayesha, the reason I sort of did a long explanation on that is to sort of frame it for the Labour Party. Like, how much of a problem is this for Keir Starmer when the Lib Dems appear more left-wing than him when it comes to raising money for public services?
I don't think it is a massive problem for him, Beth, to be absolutely honest. The Labour Party is just trying to win this election. The Labour Party is always seen as being not trusted. That's the attack from the right on the economy. So the Labour Party, if it suddenly was to in its manifesto go, guess what, everybody? We're going to sort of raise all your taxes now. That would be an absolute gift to the Conservatives. The reason the Labour Party has not won elections recently is not because people have looked at the Labour Party and gone, do you know what? They're not left-wing enough. That's not been the problem at all. The Labour Party is, look, I know it's a strategy that a lot of people get really annoyed about because it's not the most thrilling or exciting strategy. They are playing things very, very safe. The only taxes that they said they're going to put up is VAT on private schools, a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, and they're going to do some stuff with sort of private equity.
And then a bit of non-doms.
And non-doms, yeah, non-dom stuff, right?
They actually say no plans on others.
To jump in here, Ayesha, if I can say, I think Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been giving themselves a bit of latitude here and probably being a little bit smart, because as we know, they're talking about a windfall tax on oil and gas and on non-doms and VAT on schools. But their key pledge, the one that they kind of, you can take this to the bank type pledges, there will be no tax rises on working people. Now, what does working people mean and what does it not mean?
Yeah.
So that leaves space in future. If there's a budget line that they desperately want to raise money for, they can say on things like capital gains, because that's on investments, it's not on people, even though the people that have shares usually work. They can raise business taxes of various kinds. They can also raise inheritance tax. So there is latitude there should they need to fund something. But their key pledge is on the working people, which is not I bet that's been road tested to within an inch of its life, actually, because it's a canny way of putting it.
I'm sure it has been road tested, but I do think sometimes I think there are some people who are harbouring under this hope, and I understand why, because I do totally respect the points that Paul Johnson and the IFS makes. All of this stuff is really difficult. There are £20 billion worth of cuts coming down the tracks as well, which is going to be incredibly difficult, whoever wins. But there's a lot of people who think that once Rachel Reeves, and this is probably more Rachel Reeves even than Keir Starmer, once Rachel Reeves, if she becomes Chancellor, is suddenly going to take a mask off and go, hey, right, I'm going to start taxing everybody and going to start like turning on the spending taps. I don't think she is going to do that. Where I think there might be some wriggle room is around the fiscal rules. But I think what will happen is that if Labour win the election, they will understandably say, look, we've just got in. We need to get the drains up and have a look and just see what the state of the public finances are. And look, Labour's getting a lot of criticism for this, but I understand the political calculus. Labour's doing really well. For the first time, like in the history of time, Labour is leading the polls, right? And I say this as Labour president. I can't believe it. I'm scarred by every election I fought since 2010. I mean, the last election I fought that I won was the 2005 election campaign with Tony Blair. So I know more than anybody. I have the scars on my back. I understand the frustration that people feel, but trust me, it would be total political suicide for Labour to come out right now and go, we're going to raise your taxes. That would be an absolute gift to the Conservatives. But if they want to win this election, even though the polls are very good, just look at history. The Labour Party cannot take for granted and just bank a win, because right now the polls are looking good.
Ruth, though, the Tories are onto something here, aren't they?
Yes.
You can't trust them not to raise your taxes. There must be a reason that they keep going back to that argument, right?
I think the reason that Tories are hammering Labour on it now is Ayesha's right. It would be suicide from the Labour Party to say, because of the finances, we are going to charge you more tax, so you're going to pay more, you're in a cost of living crisis, everything's got hard for you, you've got less money to spend, we're going to take more of it as a government, and in return for that, you're going to get shitter services, because that's where we are in the cycle at the moment, because that's where the economy is. And, you know, that is a catastrophic sell, because at the moment, we know that there are still cuts that need to come to services.
All I'll say is, look, I mean, I do agree with a lot of what Ruth said, but I think the other thing which is difficult for the Tories, it's very difficult for Tories to say don't trust Labour because they'll raise your taxes when taxes are at a record high, and the Conservative Party will admit that. As for the Liberal Democrats are really interesting. They've been quite under the radar, apart from all the crazy stunts from Ed Davey, who's like living his best life and sort of being part of Banzai, you know, every single thing is like a sort of stunt. It's interesting that they have suddenly come up with this manifesto with lots of tax and spend. But it doesn't matter for the Liberal Democrats. Nobody thinks they're going to win. So they have got the space. And they've also, by the way, said they want to, having said they're not really getting involved in Brexit, they've come back saying, oh, actually, we're going to join the single market as well. So they're now being more risky now because they can be, because nobody thinks they're going to win.
We'll come back to manifestos just to make the point that when you look at polling, 1 in 6 people think Tories won't raise tax and 1 in 4 believe Labour won't. So on both sides, the public are not trusting what the politicians are saying. We got to move on, because one way we do like to try and hold people to account is in live debate formats. And I wanted to talk to you about the Sky Leaders event, which is happening in Grimsby on Wednesday. It's not a head-to-head, it's more of a back-to-back. Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer will take part in separate 20-minute interviews with yours truly before I do a Q&A with the audience with them. Isn't that exciting?
It is.
So we're going to do 20 minutes each. Going to do an in-depth interview where I put them through their paces, and then the audience is going to get their hands on them and probably give them harder questions than I do. We're doing it in Grimsby because Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes is the type of constituency that's going to determine the outcome of the election. And we've been reporting from here all year, and I'm going to be in the hot seat. So I'm really excited, and I'm in Grimsby. So look, I wanted to see what you thought about the format, ladies, because we've had head-to-heads where they debate with each other, but we're trying this different format. But actually, we did it for the leaders event for the Conservative Party. But what I like about this is the audience get to ask questions, and there'll be time to let the questions breathe. Ayesha, how would you prepare a leader for this sort of event?
I really like this format. I mean, I have so far found, I have to be honest, all the leaders' debates pretty unedifying. I'm not saying that just from a party political point. I'm just saying from a performance point of view. I don't think anybody has really sort of knocked it out the park. I really like this format. I think it's really good for the public. But one of the reasons why I think you're a good journalist is you often ask the questions, not that the lobby want asked, you often ask the questions that people at home want asking. And I think it's really important that you do that, because sometimes when you see these big interviews, they can be a bit inside baseball, and that's not what the public want. So when you're prepping somebody for this, I'm not saying this to be rude to you or whoever, you're almost easier to go up against than the questions from the audience, because if I'm prepping Keir or Ed or whoever, I'm going to study you.
Yeah,
I'm going to study your interview technique. I'm going to study how you go in for the kill. So we're going to think of how to take on you. But then taking on the public is very different. Sometimes that is when a moment can happen.
We are in front of an audience. And I think the thing is that as an interviewer as well, as you said, it's like, I'm not doing this as a political editor sitting at conference in a room with a prime minister or a leader of an opposition. I'm doing it in front of an audience, and I have to kind of really speak for them. So Ruth, as a politician, how different is it doing it in a kind of closed off room with political editors to in front of an audience where they're gonna feed off you?
But the most important thing you always remember is that actually the voters are through the camera and they're at home. So it's not necessarily about managing the room and managing the journalist. It's also about making sure that the messages go where you need them to go. The most important people is the voter at home. And the way that you have to be light on your feet about this is about how you approach things. And how your format for Sky is very interesting is you can win against a journalist. You're allowed to win against a political journalist that's having a joust. You're allowed to make points. You're not allowed to win against the member of the public, because even if you win,
so
you
lose
have to, because you look like you're bullying.
Yeah,
so the
interesting.
tonal shift between the interview section to the public section, they have, and I'm not sure how good actually either Keir or Rishi are at tonal shifts.
It's interesting that
they can land a line, but I'm not sure how good they are at that.
Rishi Sunak's going to feel quite defensive going into this, particularly because of the D-Day fiasco that we've discussed. And I think Rishi Sunak tonally is a bit more uncomfortable with people. We've seen him try to have interactions with normal people and it's gone a bit wrong. Like when you ask that homeless guy, like, did he work in finance and all of that sort of thing. A big part of this is going to be able to pivot to try and answer questions from the audience, but also try and connect with them and show some empathy and some emotional intelligence.
I hadn't thought about it like this, that the pivot that they have to do from being in what is actually me interviewing them, quite a familiar thing for both of them, into an unknown about a Q&A with the audience. But also, for me in this situation, I'm not hard-nosed political editor in a room sealed off. Like, I have an audience, and I really have to channel what I think they might, what, as you said, what they might want me to talk about, what they think the big issues are, in order to keep them engaged in the programme as well, I think.
Are you going to sort of change how you would do an interview with one? Because you've interviewed these guys loads of times.
We've been doing prep for the reason I haven't been on telly that much, I've been podding still because, I'm obsessed with podding now. But I haven't been on telly that much because actually also telly is quite laborious to make in a lovely way, but if you're on the story, you're on it all day because you've got to make the package and you've got to do the live. So I haven't been doing much telly. We have been working hard on how to do these interviews and what do we want to do. And in terms of, I think it is a bit different for me, Ayesha, because, for once, there's time to breathe. So in the past, sometimes I get viewers might message me and go, why do you keep interrupting? Why are you always interrupting? Why are you always rushing? It's like, because I've got 6 minutes. And if I let them speak for 2 minutes and I don't interrupt, that's a third of my time gone. And what people I think misunderstand sometimes is when you're political editor you have 6-7 minutes. The longest you ever get is 10 minutes at conference. But if I have 20 minutes, that's a different pace. And I need to sort of be aware of that as well, because my instinct is to be like, I got to interrupt them. And they're like, oh, no, you don't. You've got 18 minutes. You don't need to interrupt them, Beth. Just let it breathe. For me, I'm actually more interested in the Q&A with the audience, because I think in the debates that we've seen so far, the questions from the audience have been great.
I think one of the frustrations that a lot of us have felt watching the leaders' debate so far, and I think this is a frustration from just your average sort of punter tuning into, your political geek like myself, is that you're right, the best questions have come from the audience, but we haven't had the opportunity to go back to the audience and get some feedback from them about how they think the politicians have answered or not answered their questions. So one thing I'm really hoping you guys will do is go back to the person who asked the question, because I think it's been quite frustrating. We've had great questions, then you get all the kind of blah from the politicians and the stooshy, and then they move on. I would really like the moderator to go back to the person and say, do you think they actually answered your question?
And that's exactly what we would like to do. Part of the problem about being the leader of the opposition, which you will know well, which his team will have talked to me about, is that the Prime Minister calls a press conference or the Prime Minister makes an announcement and we all come and we run it on our news and we all come and we get on the plane with him. And when you are the Prime Minister, the office of Prime Minister means that you get a lot of attention and you can dominate the airwaves and you can set the agenda. When you're the leader of the opposition, it's changing now because they're so far ahead in the polls, but you have to fight for attention. And part of Keir Starmer's battle in this campaign, really, isn't it? To try and make people understand him more. Because we joke about the toolmaker thing, but, as I said on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, only 11% of the population know that his dad was a toolmaker. What they might see is Sir Keir Starmer and think he's an aristocrat. They might not know where his back, because he's not as knowable. So I think for him, these sorts of events, I would imagine, are a way of, it's not, he probably, to be honest, he probably thinks, oh, bloody hell, if I got to be interviewed by Beth Rigby again. But that's not the bit for him. The bit will be the audience. And I think for Rishi Sunak as well, he actually, if you watch him I've watched him in Q&As and he was doing it, he actually on his feet can be very good at this stuff and very nimble. So I think it's a massive opportunity for him as well. But anyway, I'm going to put the big plug in for the battle for number 10. The programme starts on Sky News at 7 p.m. on Wednesday evening. I'll be taking over at 7:30. I think we've got Sophie Ridge doing the warm-up. Sarah J. Mee will be with me. We've got Kay Burley there. Jane Secker will be there. Gillian Joseph will be there doing the 10 o'clock news. It's an all-woman lineup, which I don't know if it was intended, but I quite love it. So it's all the ladies and a couple of blokes are turning up to talk about politics.
Yes, I love that you've let a few blokes in.
Yeah, I've just a couple, you know, the ones that run the country, those ones, yeah?
Get the popcorn out. It is going to be a cracking night.
Tune in, and we'll be back on Friday, and that will be with Jess's second election sub. And Ayesha, you'll be back with us next Tuesday for another episode of Electoral Dysfunction Extra. Thank you so much for coming on. We had a lovely conversation. Now, don't forget to keep in touch and keep those WhatsApp messages coming in. Get me on the burner phone, 07934 200 444. Email me or email electoraldysfunction@sky.uk, or you can tweet me at Beth Rigby. Ruth's done a runner because she's got to go and pick her child up, so I've just got an empty camera in front of me. But Ayesha and I, we can do the big goodbyes. Goodbye!
See you later!